Good morning. I want to invite you to turn with me, if you would, to Luke, the 9th chapter, please. Luke chapter 9 this morning. And I want to read just a handful of verses together there. Luke chapter 9, verse 1. And Jesus called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all the demons and to heal diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to perform healing. Now notice with me in verse 6. And departing, they began going about among the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. And then move with me to verse 10. And when the apostles returned, they gave an account to him of all that they had done. And taking them with him, he withdrew by himself to a city called Bethsaida. But the multitudes were aware of this and followed him, and welcoming them, he began speaking to them about the kingdom of God and curing those who had need of healing. I want to ask a simple question from this text. How did Jesus prepare leaders with shepherding hearts and shepherding skill? When you look at the model that we find here in Luke chapter 9, how did Jesus prepare leaders who had shepherding hearts and who had shepherding skill? Go with me to chapter 10. Go with me to chapter 10 and verse 1. And read with me here. Now after this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them 2 and 2 ahead of him to every city and place where he himself was going to come. And then it describes the instruction that he gave to them. Then verse 17. And the 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. Question about this model in Luke chapter 10. How did Jesus prepare disciples to be a shepherding community? How did he prepare these 70 disciples to be a part of a shepherding community? A community of people where folks would grow and where they would thrive as believers. I want to suggest to you that Jesus prepared leaders and he prepared disciples in precisely the same way. What he did was call them to go with him into the field and to work together in God's harvest. They worked with Jesus side by side, shoulder to shoulder, tending sheep. They learned to call sheep, they learned to feed sheep, they learned to heal them, they learned to minister to them, they learned how to rescue them, they learned how to grow them. And so together with them in the field, God taught them shepherding hearts and he taught them shepherding skill while they were on the job, while they were doing it, and while they were together in the field. I want you to go back with me to Luke chapter 9, and I want to suggest to you that we see him doing 2 things when he's together with them in the field. Jesus spends time in the field communicating with them and collaborating with them together in God's increase. He's talking to them about the things that they need to learn, the hearts that they need to have, the skills that they need to acquire if these 12 men are going to be his shepherds. And he is letting them participate in the work of shepherding people. So that the things that he's communicating to them, they're then doing. They're trying them with real people in real situations, in real experiences. And so he's communicating with them and he's collaborating with them in this work. And as a result, he's cultivating their hearts and he's cultivating their skill for shepherding. Notice with me some of the things that he's communicating with them about here in chapter 9. Look with me at chapter 9, verse 3, where it says, he said to them as he sends them out to go and teach, he said to them, take nothing for your journey, neither a staff, nor a bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not even have 2 tunics apiece. And he goes on to describe other things briefly that he says to them, instructing them about how to go. In chapter 10, he says a lot more to the 70 in terms of how to instruct them to go. But the thing that I want you to see about his communication is that he shares instruction with them and he shares direction with them about the best way to do this. He gives them instruction about the best practices. But it's not just academic. It's not just academic. Notice the other kind of communication that takes place in the text. Look with me at verse 10, where it says, and when the disciples returned, there's more communication. They gave an account to him of all that they had done. When the disciples come back, they share news with Jesus about God's open doors and about God's increase. They talk about the things that God did with them. When the 70 return in chapter 10 and verse 17, they likewise share news about the doors that God opened and about His increase, about how it was that even the demons were subject to them as they were teaching and as they were healing and as they were releasing people that were demon-possessed. Look with me at verse 12, where it says, and the day began to decline. This is when the multitude has gathered together when they're trying to rest. It says, the day began to decline, and the 12 came and said to him, send the multitude away, that they may go out into the surrounding villages and countryside and find lodging and get something to eat, for here we're in a desolate place. Another communication that takes place with Jesus and the 12 is that they share judgments and perspectives and evaluate next steps. You know, here's their judgment and their perspective when the day is wearing long and all the people are there and they've not eaten all day long. Their perspective or their judgment is we need to send them into the villages so they can go find something to eat. But Jesus offers a different perspective in verse 13. He said to them, you give them something to eat. The point I want us to see here is that they share judgments and perspectives and they decide what's the next step. He's teaching them as they make those decisions together. Go with me, if you would, to verse 49 of chapter 9. It says, John says to Jesus, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to hinder him because he does not follow along with us. One of the things they shared with Jesus is their experiences. They said, we encountered this man and he's not following us and he's casting out demons. And then Jesus gives them feedback about those experiences. Jesus says in verse 50, do not hinder him, for he who is not against you is for you. Do you see that as they're communicating about things that are happening in real time? They're sharing news about how God is opening doors. They're sharing news about how it is that God is giving increase to their work. Jesus is sharing with them instructions and direction about what is the best thing to do and the best way to do their work of reaching out to people. They're sharing judgments and perspectives and thinking about what to do next. And they're sharing their experiences and they're getting feedback about those experiences. They're communicating about the things that they're doing together. But notice as well that they're also doing things together. I mean, this is not happening in a classroom. This isn't happening. You know, just in a schoolhouse. This isn't happening in a synagogue. It's happening out in the field as they are ministering to people, as they're teaching people. They have gotten out of the barn and they've gotten into the field and they're with people while all these things are going on. So their communication is not academic, it's not hypothetical, it's not theoretical. The things that they're talking about are practical, they are experiential, they are real world. They're not just talking about what to think and about what to believe. They're talking about what to do. They're talking about how to do it. They're talking about how to change both themselves and the people to whom they're ministering. They're talking about how to win for God, and they are participating in that as they're doing this together. Jesus has yoked them together as a team as they're working together in the field. And together with Jesus and with one another, they have more wisdom than they would have if they were operating independently. They have more skill, they have more motivation, they have more accountability, they have more influence because they're doing it together. They have more strength, they're experiencing more personal growth, and they're discovering more increase. Because Jesus has taken them along with Him into the field to go and minister to people and go share God's truth with them. I want you to see some of the things that they experience together as they're in the field. Look with me at verse 12. Again, as the day began to decline, the 12 come to Jesus and they say, "Send the multitudes away." What are they experiencing there? What are they experiencing together? They're weary. They're weary. Is that going to be something they're going to experience as leadership? Weariness. Yeah, they're going to experience that. Look at verse 13. Jesus says to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless perhaps we go and buy food for all of these people." They experience inadequacy, don't they? I mean, they have limited resources. Is that something that leadership is going to experience? Yeah. And so they experience inadequacy. They experience insufficiency. They experience weariness. Look at verse 18. "It came about that while he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he questioned them, saying, 'Who do the multitudes say that I am?' And they answered and said, 'John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others that one of the prophets of old has risen again.'" I want you to see that together they experience error. I mean, they experience people who are misinformed, who have wrong concepts about who Jesus is. But they're experiencing that. They're facing that together. Is leadership going to experience that? Are they going to have to learn how to address misinformation or ignorance? Yeah, they're going to have to learn how to address that. And it's going to have to start with what they learned when they were feeding the multitude. They got to learn to listen to people. And so he taught the 12 to interact with people so they could listen and know where people are. Look at, if you would, at verse 28 of the text. It says, "And some days after these sayings, it came about that he took along Peter and John and James, and they went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming." And so these 3 disciples, these 3 apostles, experienced the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain. One of the things that they experienced together with him was wonder. They experienced amazing things in the presence of Jesus. And leadership, is leadership going to experience that too? Or are they going to experience wonder, the awesomeness of what God does? Or the awesomeness of something that God reveals? They experience that. Look at verse 40 of the text. It says, "When they came down from the mountain, they're confronted by a great multitude and by a man whose son is demon-possessed. And Jesus' disciples could not help him." They couldn't help the man. And so in verse 40, Jesus is confronted with that. The man says to Jesus, "I begged your disciples to cast out the demon, and they could not." One of the things that Jesus lets them experience together in the field is failure. They can't help. They fail. And is leadership going to experience that? Yes, and they experience it. Look, if you would, at verse 45 of the text. Jesus is talking to his disciples about how he's going to be delivered into the hands of men in verse 44. And he says this to them just after he delivers a man from a demon. And so you've got to get the irony of that in order to be in the disciples' shoes. They just watched Jesus cast out a demon that they couldn't cast out. And now Jesus is saying that he that delivered demons is going to be delivered himself into the hands of men. And he's going to be betrayed, and he's going to be rejected and crucified. And in verse 45, it says, "They did not understand this statement, and it was concealed from them so they might not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him about this statement." They experienced confusion. Is leadership going to experience that? Yes. In verse 46, "And an argument arose among them as to which of them might be the greatest." They experienced competition. Is that a problem with leadership? Yes. A similar story is found in verse 49, the one that we read earlier about John forbidding someone that was casting out demons because he was he wasn't among us. So here they are being elitist, exclusive. In verse 54, the disciples are going into Samaritan cities, and the people of Samaria don't receive them. And in verse 54 it says, and when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? They experience frustration, indignation even. Does leadership experience that? Being frustrated with people. Yeah. Here they are frustrated, and this isn't the kind of heart of shepherds. And Jesus needs to teach them that. In verse 57, it says, and as they were going along the road, someone said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. And then there's two other people that follow, one in verse 59 and one in verse 61, that are also called to follow Jesus and offer up excuses for not following. One of the things that they as a leadership experience is fickleness. The fickleness of followers. Is leadership going to experience that? Yeah. They're going to experience the problem of fickleness as well. Now, all of these experiences, weariness, inadequacy, error, wonder, failure, confusion, competition, frustration, fickleness, when we appoint shepherds as a people, are they going to experience those things? Yes, they're going to experience those things. And what Jesus is doing with his 12 as he is preparing them to be shepherds, as they're communicating and as they're collaborating together in the field, what he's doing in all of these experiences is testing and trying and proving and shaping the hearts of shepherds in the midst of all of these things that are trying and testing their hearts and their skill. He's cultivating them to be shepherds in the midst of all of this. And they are learning some very, very important lessons. For instance, go back with me to the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 9 and verse 12. Everything in Luke chapter 9 is about leadership. It's about training shepherds. And one of the things that Jesus is doing in the feeding of the 5,000 is he's teaching these 12 men that leadership is not just a monologue in front of a multitude. They have been out preaching and they've been out teaching in the synagogues. They've been standing before multitudes. They've been teaching them and they've been healing them. But Jesus is teaching them when he has them feed the 5,000, he's teaching them how to be among the people, not just in front of the people. He's teaching them how to touch sheep. He's teaching them how to pet them, how to feed them, how to love them, how to listen to them. And this interaction is so important. They are weary and they are tired, but they've got to have the heart for people so they don't just stand in front of them, but so they get connected to them. And so this is such an important leadership lesson for them to learn. That of not just teaching, but of mingling and of ministering and of listening to the people. In verse 18, when Jesus asks them the questions, who do the multitudes say that I am? And they offer Jesus all of these different opinions, that he's John the Baptist, or that he's Elijah, or that he's one of the prophets. I want you to see an important lesson that Jesus models for them there. Jesus' ego is not pricked by the fact that the people don't understand who he is. And it's such an important lesson for them. Leadership is not name recognition. Leadership is not having a big reputation. In fact, the only way that Jesus is going to be able to get the people to really understand who he is to ultimately be rejected by the people. That's how he's going to win license with them. That's how he wins license with us, is that Jesus is so invested in reaching out to the people that they hurt him, that they reject him. And the way that they discover who he is seeing how he behaves when he's rejected, when he's despised, when he suffers. Now Is our leadership, when we have shepherds, are they going to experience rejection sometimes? Is their ego going to be pricked? Are they going to hurt for people and because of people? And are they going to even sometimes suffer at the hands of people, of the people that they try to tend? Yes. And how we handle that is an important ingredient in whether or not we have the kind of leadership that Jesus modeled. Jesus hurt for people. Jesus hurt with people. Jesus hurt at the hands of people. And it's how he won the license to influence them. That is an important leadership lesson. When they go up to the mountain, Peter and James and John like when they're on the mountain and when Jesus is transfigured, because that is the picture, that is the image of greatness. It's the image of leadership that they like. But Jesus teaches them on the mountain and when they come down from the mountain that leadership is not exercising our rights and privileges. Jesus has every right to stay up on the mountain. He has every right to throw off the veil of flesh and to show His glory, to show His real identity to people. But what He does when He's after the transfiguration is the important leadership lesson to them, because what He does is forfeit His rights and His privileges to come down off the mountain. Leaders have to learn that. We've got to learn to come down off the mountain and yield, surrender our privileges, our rights, and yield ourselves to God's yoke in ministering to desperate sinners. Jesus comes down from the mountain, and when He comes down from the mountain, He finds this father who is crying over his only son, who is afflicted with this demon. And Jesus comes down off the mountain so He can help this man in that situation. As John said, that's personal, the salvation that he experiences there. And what Jesus models there is what real leadership looks like. Now, leadership that doesn't learn those lessons, I want you to look with me at verse 40. When this man, the man that has the demon-possessed son, look at what he says about the disciples. I begged your disciples to cast it out, and they could not. Could I say to you that leadership that doesn't learn the lessons that Jesus is teaching the disciples here will be impotent? Leadership that doesn't learn to surrender rights and privileges to minister. Leadership that doesn't learn the kind of heart for people that will fill people the way that they learn to do when they're feeding the 5,000. That recognizes it's not about people knowing who I am, but it's about me yielding myself to be a servant to them, to minister God's grace to them. Leadership that doesn't learn that will be impotent because it won't invite the hand of God. But leaders that learn God's heart, and that's what Jesus is teaching them in these experiences, leaders that learn God's heart will find God's hand. And so in verse 43, after Jesus cast out the demon, it says, and they all were amazed at the greatness of God. They still don't even know who Jesus is, but they see the greatness of God in the things that He does. And leaders that learn God's heart will find God's hand. All of that leads me to this conclusion. The best way to show God that we want shepherds, for us as a congregation, the best way to show God that we want shepherds is to share His heart for souls. The best way to prove ourselves ready for leadership is to do the work of ministering to souls. The best way to prepare one another for leadership is to work shoulder to shoulder in God's field and in God's flock. And the way I know that it's the best way is because it was Jesus' way. It's the way He trained the 12. It's the way He trained the 70. He took them along with Him in the field, and He communicated with them, and they collaborated together in ministering the kingdom to people. We in our culture do that. We don't do it that way. If you want the kingdom, we got a sign out front that says Chelsea Church of Christ, and you show up here on Sunday at 9:30 and at 10:30, and you will find some kingdom, brother. Right? I mean, you come and you learn about, this is, if you want kingdom, it's here. I want you to see how Jesus did that. Certainly we can experience kingdom when we are congregated together, but He sent the people to take the kingdom to people. I mean, they took the kingdom into the field where the people were. And that's the part that we've got to get, we've got to do, we've got to exercise. We need leaders to exercise. We need to take the kingdom to the people. We need to bring it to them. Application. I want to call on all of our men, to commit 1 hour a week to coming together, communicating together, and collaborating together in taking the kingdom to people. I'm going to talk in our men's meeting today about the details of that. But I want to call on us as men to commit to giving our time, 1 hour a week, to communicating together and collaborating together in bringing the kingdom to people. And in our men's meeting today, we'll talk more about the details of that. But I think there are things that we can apply from what Jesus does with the 12 here that can help us with fulfilling that mission. The mission of ministering the gospel to people. The mission of bringing the kingdom to people so that they experience the truth of God and they experience the freedom from all the ways in which Satan is beating people today. That connects to everything that we most want to be and that God has called us to be as a people. And the shortest path, I believe, to shepherding leaders as a congregation and a shepherding culture as a congregation is for us to go and work in the field together. Do you believe that? I just believe that's the model Jesus teaches us here. And my prayer is that over the course of the next year that we can activate that we can be mobilized, and that God will raise up obvious shepherds among us because we are busying ourselves in that work, and that God grows a healthy environment for growing disciples among us because we are practicing that kind of heart and that kind of skill. Thank you for listening so patiently today. If you are subject to Jesus' invitation to come and to put on His yoke and to leave off the yoke of sin, then as we sing together and as we praise together, we invite you to come and make Jesus the Lord of your life while we stand in that while we sing.